Okay. Good evening, friends. My name is Bob Kelly, and on behalf of the Powhatan County Democratic Committee, I welcome you to our forum commemorating the 60th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Our focus for tonight is going to be today's reality versus Dr. King's dream. The seeds of this forum were planted in June when the Supreme Court decided the colleges may no longer use race as a factor in admissions. A certain ilk of politicians celebrated this decision and kept repeating the only line from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech that they can never seem to recall. Dr. King stated that I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That was an aspirational portion of his speech, which had been deadly realistic at its beginning. Dr. King cast an optimistic vision that we might overcome the pervasive racism and economic inequality that plagued America at that time. First, we'll watch Dr. King's speech in its entirety because I think that's important, and then we'll hear from our panelists. We are blessed to have 3 wonderful guests who will contribute their own insights and points of view. Delegate Candi Mundon King represents Virginia's 2nd House District, which includes Prince William and Stafford counties. Delegate Mundon King was first elected to the House of Delegates in the 2021 special election and is a member of the Virginia General Assembly Privileges and Election Committee, Finance Committee, and Public Safety Committee. She is a mom, wife, former small business owner, and a community leader. Delegate Mundon King was born and raised in Virginia. She and her husband, Josh King, an Iraq War veteran and deputy sheriff, live in Dumfries with their children, including a nonverbal teenage daughter with autism. Reverend Terrell Glenn is the pastor of the Guildfield Baptist Church in Midlothian, Virginia, and is a public school teacher. Reverend Glenn is a 2017 graduate of Old Dominion University, earning a bachelor's in philosophy with a minor in sociology. He was licensed in September 2013 and ordained in 2019 at the Mount Sinai Baptist Church in Midlothian, Virginia. Reverend Glenn is a 2022 graduate of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, obtaining a Master's of Divinity. During his matriculation, Reverend Glenn was involved in the STVU Theologue, I believe that's the way you pronounce it, Council, which sought to provide seminary students with advocacy, fellowship, and voice within the seminary context. Reverend Glenn is the youngest pastor in Guildfield's history, and he is currently pursuing a Doctor of Ministry degree from Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School. And then last but certainly not least, Senator Ghazala Hashmi, PhD, serves in the Virginia's General Assembly representing the 10th Senatorial District, which includes parts of Richmond City, Chesterfield County, and all of Powhatan County. She sits on the following Senate committees: Education and Health, Agriculture, Conservation and Natural Resources, General Laws and Technology, and Local Government. Senator Hashmi also chairs the Senate Subcommittee on Public Education. Prior to her election in November 2019, Senator Hashmi had a long career in higher education in Virginia. Senator Hashmi continues to serve as state senator for Powhatan, at least until the November elections, when Powhatan, unfortunately, will lose her as a representative due to redistricting. Our panelists reflect Dr. King's belief that faith, education, and legislation holistically blend to create social activism. Dr. King viewed himself as a revolutionary, but in modern times, some have de-radicalized his message and manipulated his image to match their own ambitions. As you will see in this speech, Dr. King preached nonviolence, but it was for a purpose. He did not believe that turning the other cheek meant waiting for the establishment to graciously surrender power and influence. He saw nonviolence as Gandhi and Thoreau did. It was a means to influence and embarrass those in power and force them to change. In that spirit, here's one of the greatest pieces of oration in recorded history. When the speech ends, we will hear from our panelists. And let me just bring this up and
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the one threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Okay, welcome back. I know that was a while, but it's every time I hear that, it just is amazing. So first off, now we're going to speak. We're going to have discussion with our speakers. First of all, start off with Delegate Candi Mundon King. Delegate King. Can you hear me?
Thank you so much. I get goosebumps whenever can you hear me?
Yes, we're good.
I get goosebumps whenever I hear that. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to commemorate Dr. King's speech, but also all of the hundreds of men and women who made the March on Washington happen. A march that was 20, 30 years in the making, a march that brought together so many people. And so I'm Delegate Candi Mundon King. I've had the privilege of representing Prince William and Stafford County and the Virginia General Assembly for the last 2 years. And nothing in my background suggests that I should even be here today, that I should even be alive. You know, Dr. King had a dream, and 19 years later, I was born into America's nightmare. My family spent decades toiling away as sharecroppers, and as Dr. King said in his speech, moved from one smaller ghetto to a larger one. And when I was born, we faced together the crack cocaine epidemic that decimated Black families throughout our country. We faced economic conditions that were designed to keep us oppressed. We faced all of these things together. Oh, but the roses that grew from the concrete. That dream of Dr. King that still inspires us, that still rings true today, is the dream that can take the granddaughter of a sharecropper with a third grade education into the halls of the House of Delegates, where she sits in a seat that was designed for men who enslaved her family. So while we lived America's nightmare, while we had so many firsts and so many devastations, we are still living Dr. King's dream. And I'm so grateful to be able to honor his legacy, the legacy of his family, the work that they continue to do. And in particular, of one Virginian in particular, a young woman born in Richmond, Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, who was one of the key organizers of the March on Washington, who sat on that dais looking as regal as the queen that I have always known her to be, and who fought for women to be included in the dream, for women to have a seat at the table. And so I'm so excited tonight to talk more about Dr. King's dream, the reality that we live in, and the women who will lead the way in bringing our communities together to continue that fight. So thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, Delegate. I appreciate it. And we'll get back to some of that later, but go next to a woman who is leading as well, Dr. Ghazala Hashmi, and especially with education, which she's been a huge advocate of. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, and for the invitation to join you all this evening. And I'm just very honored to be here in recognition and celebration of this very, very important anniversary. You're right, goosebumps, chills every time I hear Dr. King's speech and the resonant message that is contained in that speech. It is still just as powerful today as it was when he delivered it 60 years ago. I want to speak very personally about what that message and what the effort of the civil rights movement really meant for millions of people, and not just the African American community here in the United States. You know, I was born in India, and my dad had come to work on his PhD in 1964, and then my brother and my mom and I followed 5 years later. So it was in 1969 that I came, and we moved into a very small a town in southeast Georgia. And I remember even at that young age being conscious of the color line. Everything was segregated in that little town. Our doctors' offices were segregated. The school was segregated. They weren't quite sure what to do with two little brown children because we didn't fit into either category. So it wasn't until I was starting second grade that my school was desegregated, and we were able to really see the hard work of bringing some degree of racial justice to our community. I also think about the fact that my parents in 1971, as relatively brand new immigrants to this country, were able to purchase a home in a white neighborhood. And it wasn't until I was older and was able to really examine and understand the issues of racial division in my little town that I recognized how powerfully unjust that was, that new immigrants to this country were able to have privileges and opportunities that were denied to the families that had actually built that community literally through blood and sweat and tears. And that injustice has always stayed with me. And so I've been very conscious of those facts. You know, the doors of immigration to this country were closed largely to Asian populations, East Asians, South Asians, until the 1960s. And it's a direct result of the civil rights movement that we ended up seeing the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and the efforts that we saw through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, that we were able to open the doors to immigration for Asian populations. Otherwise, there had been quite an effort to restrict immigration from those countries. So my being here, my family's access to all the opportunity in this country is directly as a result of the sacrifices of those who marched and struggled and fought as hard as they did to open the doors of opportunity to everybody in this country. So I know my debt of gratitude to Dr. King and to every leader and everyone who worked in that civil rights movement. So we joined together in this important fight. So thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. And then, Reverend Glenn, I got to be fortunate enough to see you at the Black History Month celebration for the Powhatan NAACP, and I came away very impressed. So I really wanted to hear from you as far as being a young church leader, especially.
God bless you. Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this great anniversary commemorating the Reverend. We got to make sure we put the Reverend in there. He is ordained and licensed. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I do apologize. People are talking and everything like that. All I have is just a small piece preacher wise. And so I do want to first thank you, Mr. Bob Kelly, for the opportunity, to the entire Powhatan County Democratic Committee as well. Also to my fellow colleagues sharing this platform with me. I do want to honor the Honorable Delegate Candi Mundon King. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be in your presence as well. And then also to the Honorable Senator Ghazala Hashmi. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I do apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name as well. I just, if you will allow me the opportunity, I want to talk from the standpoint of deferred dreams. So as we stand 60 years to the day of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, there's many things that we can be grateful for and grateful of and appreciative of. Many struggles and trials that we faced 60 years ago aren't as prevalent now as it was. When we consider the opportunities available, resources within reach, diversity within disciplines, we can concur with the resounding exclamation, we have come a long way. We have come a long way from black and white TVs. We've come a long way from landlines, which you have to press the phone number and then turn it to dial the number. We've come a long way from the clutches of the Cold War. We've come a long way from Jim Crow. We've come a long way from separate but equal. We've come a long way from the heinous spectacle of public lynchings. We've come a long way from the initial public school integrations. We've come a long way, but even though we've come a long way and we stand here to celebrate how far we've come in 60 years, we still feel adamant about the long way we still have to go to make Dr. King's dream a true reality. I don't know about anybody else, family, but when I equate Dr. MLK's speech with the reality of our lived conditions today, I'm actually left with one word, and that word is deferment. And family, as a lifelong learner, currently in a doctoral program as we speak, we know something about getting loans in order to be in education, in order to obtain education. And one of the beautiful things about deferment is that while you are getting your education, you won't have to pay back your loans because your loan will be in what's called deferment. But what is not talked about is although you don't have to pay your loans back, that interest is still compounding. And stay with me, family, because the interest in our treatment of our oppressed sisters and brothers is steadily compounding while the loan payment for justice and peace remains unpaid. And family, the dream is deferred when we have school board officials and board of supervisor officials trying their hardest to whitewash history of the United States when you cannot really tell the story of the United States without telling the story of enslaved Africans who were snatched from their homelands and made to be cheap labor for their white counterparts. The dream is deferred when organizations and corporations care more about the status quo and maintaining instead of facilitating an environment of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The dream is deferred when corporations and CEOs require their employees to think the same, act the same, believe the same, and look the same. We are the land of the melting pot. And in order to be the melting pot, you have to have diversity, equity, and inclusion. The dream is deferred when people refuse to admit their explicit biases and refuse to be conscious of their implicit biases. The dream is deferred when minority home ownership in Powhatan County decreases from double digits to just 8%. Family, I stand here on the 60th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech to let everyone know that somehow, some way, the dream has now been deferred. But the good news about deferment is that the loan has to be paid at some point in time. People can push back the loan, but it still has to be paid. They can try to change loan servicers, but it still has to be paid. They can even have a co-signer, but it still has to be paid. So even in 60 years, the dream has not come to fruition, even though home ownership for minorities is below 10% in Powhatan County, even though the school boards are trying to take away Black history in our schools, I still believe in the dream. I believe that Powhatan County can experience a beautiful, as Dr. King said, oasis of diversity, equity, inclusion. I believe that our school systems can embrace holistic history that tells the truth about American history. I believe that the county can promote and facilitate equal opportunities for all persons. And the reason I believe this is because the deferment policy in the book that guides my life says, don't grow weary in well doing, for in due season you shall reap if you faint not. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was pretty compact for a preacher. So just kidding with you. But just wanted to say that, and I don't want to take up too much time with myself, but just to say, being the old guy on here, I'm the one who grew up in Connecticut, but in a white flight suburb of Connecticut. We had literally one African-American family in town where I grew up. And even when, just before I left and came down in the 1990s, we knew of towns that still had the redlining. So it's not always been in the South. Like Dr. King said, you know, even talking about in the South where you couldn't vote, but in the North you wouldn't have anybody to vote for. That's really what some of the things up there that we found. So just wanted to go with that. But one thing I wanted to get back to, as far as what we're looking at right now, where I actually carry a lot of hope right now, is what I'm seeing, and that's why I'm grateful to see all of you, is younger people leading the way now in things that are happening. And so if you could comment on that, especially with looking at Delegate Maxwell Frost and actually Representative, not Delegate, Representative Maxwell Frost in Florida, and then the Justins in Tennessee right next door, the impact that they're making. I wanted to find out how you felt about that. Anybody can go.
I'll kick it off here. I think we're seeing quite a bit in Virginia as well in terms of the tremendous diversity of folks that are running for office, that are taking leadership roles, and that are certainly going to transform our legislature here. And Delegate Candi King is a true representative of that. And we're just going to see some very significant changes all across the board in the next decade. And this includes as well minority women coming into office and into leadership roles. And so I'm optimistic in that regard that we're going to see transformation in very significant ways.
For sure. And just to add to that, Senator Hashmi is so gracious and kind. I'm a 40-year-old woman, and I'm feeling every every year of the 40. My kids remind me all the time. But that 40 is important because it was just 40 years ago that the first Black woman, Senator Yvonne Miller, was elected to the Virginia General Assembly. And so within that time, we have more women serving now than ever in the history of the General Assembly. And we have a historic number of young people, young women as well, running for these offices and not waiting. And I had the opportunity to share with someone, an old folk like me, complaining, all of these young people are running for office. And I said, go and look up the ages of the founding fathers. Go look at the 21, 25, 33-year-old. Delegate Nadarius Clark is, I think, the youngest person since James Madison or something to that effect. So this is not new. This is young people not seeing the urgent issues facing our communities and putting themselves forward at a time in their lives where they could be doing anything and they are choosing to serve. And so I'm just super excited to see all the young folks who are running for and getting elected.
I 100% concur. It is a blessing to see generations already among us, ready not only to take the baton, but to run with the baton, such as yourself, Delegate King. I also want to celebrate as well a classmate of mine who graduated with me from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, Delegate Marcia Price, 95th District. I do want to celebrate her and her work that she does as well. And so it's just one of those things where the more representation that we see, the more people will be able to see that we can get things done and we can allow and have access for more inclusiveness within our politics and pushing also pushing votes and then also pushing policies and bills on the floor, because it's not only about getting representation, but it's also about doing the work. And so I'm just so thankful for all of the young generations that have come in and done the work.
For sure. And as we talk about Reverend Dr. King, I want to see more young faith leaders running for office, because the Republican Party seems to think that they have some sort of moral high ground, or that Jesus looked down and said, okay, only you who wear the MAGA hats will make it into heaven. And those of us who are like me, who accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior at 15 years old, I know that's simply not the case. And I know that within the Democratic Party, there are people of multiple faith backgrounds who bring their faith to this work. And I want to see more young people who are running, winning, and serving, and being very loud about their faith perspective and how their faith drives them to policy that puts people first over politics. And their faith in action is faith in love and compassion and acceptance, and not the hate-filled rhetoric that we see masquerading as Christianity.
Absolutely. And while we're talking young people, I want to recognize, and I know I don't want to get into politicking, but our candidate right now for the 72nd District House of Delegates, who's on right now watching, Bilal Rayshoni, he is first and foremost, he is a teacher. He's a Lebanese American teacher in Powhatan Middle School. He teaches robotics, and he's an amazing candidate. So just wanted to shout him out real quick. Yeah, he said he's hanging out in the chat. So, hey, Bilal, but just wanted to shout him out. But speaking of education, that's one part that Reverend Glenn had brought up that I think is really crucial right now, that we're looking at, say, a Florida that's implementing the Prager University junk, I should say, junk history, where you actually have Frederick Douglass justifying slavery in a video. To me, that is one of the most obscene things I've seen offered as far as schools. That's just my personal thing, but I'd like to hear some comments on that from you guys. Could.
Well, I can. I'll start. So when we look at the systems that are uh, predicated on um, being, we understand that knowledge is power. And when you're able to control how knowledge is disseminated, you are then able to control how people believe, act, and think. And so, really, we're seeing how within public school education, where um, systems and um, the powers that be are trying to maintain a structure of knowledge that that doesn't that's not predicated on making them seem at fault. And when you try to skew truth, then everything is fallacy. And so what we're getting now is generations coming up who don't know holistic truth, their own truth. And the problem is that as generations get older, we lose uh, the means of social interaction, social fellowship, because we don't know true history. And that's being taught at the public education sector. I'm a step out the chat to let others go in before. So.
Well, I think, Bob, you said it best. It is an obscenity. It's an absolute obscenity to distort history that way and to distort our understanding of the impact of slavery and racial injustice in this country. And Frederick Douglass, of all folks, who passionately spoke about this injustice and who called out the hypocrisy of the Christian slave owner who used the Bible and their faith to justify the inhumanity of slavery. That's what's appalling to me. And so I recall when I see things like Prager University and the distortions of truth, I really am always thinking about the words of Dr. King, who called out the white moderate in letter from Birmingham jail, who is content to stay quiet, to not rock the boat, who thinks that they're going to sustain peace at the expense of justice. And it's really incumbent on everybody in this country to speak out against the fundamental bigotry that we're seeing arise through our education system, through the use of these kinds of so-called resources that are emphatically designed to corrupt education. And we need the white moderate in particular to not be moderate and to be loud and to speak out and to stand against this terrible offense that we're seeing in our education.
Absolutely. And to add to that, we need the white moderate and we need the white mothers and fathers to step up for their children. We're seeing reports that increasingly white teenage boys are being recruited for white supremacist gangs via online games and other communities where racism is pervasive. So we have to ask our neighbors who, listen, we grew up in communities where people, you believe in small government, big government. whatever those cases are. But when you perpetuate racism, you're putting your sons and daughters at risk for being out here in this world, not only racist and ignorant, but susceptible to being recruited into ruining their lives on a January 6th or in Jacksonville. And it is that moderate, that sit back, I have Black friends, but do you defend those Black friends in the face of racism? Do your children see you stand up for people who don't look like you? And we have to not be afraid to have those conversations with our neighbors. We can disagree on a lot of things, but do you want your child to head down this road that racism and bigotry leads to? And I believe most people don't, but to Reverend Glenn's point, so many of us have been miseducated into thinking that these actions are not harmful, and we see that they actually are.
I agree. We see that type of thing coming through, and we've seen it especially in Powhatan with some of the outside groups that have been coming in, such as No Left Turn in Education and Moms Defending Liberty. They throw a lot of things out and confuse people. It's not just a matter of, they've got the one side who's, just marching in lockstep. They convince people who might not be paying enough attention that, yes, we're looking out for your children. It's all about we're protecting your children from the government. It even comes down as, without mentioning names from the top right now, where we say, well, parents are no better for their children than the government. Well, that's not the choice that's out there. The choice that's out there is they're all our children. This is all us collectively right now, and people just need to know it. But that was just my comment on that. But I'd like for somebody to jump in if you want to.
Well, to that point, I believe it does have to be collective in a way. It has to be a collaboration effort because not only as schools, not only do we have to be responsible to the history that we are giving our children, but then when we come home, we also have to make sure that we are speaking the truth about history as well. Because before, I can only speak for myself, but before I went to school and learned about history, I learned about my family history from my own family. So it could be possibly that, as Delegate King said, the miseducation of parents teaching their kids about a skewed view of history, which pervades itself into these communities of oppression, segregation in schools. You see it manifest in cliques. We've all been in schools before. You see it manifest itself in having cliques, and if you're not associated with being cool, whatever that definition of cool is, then you're not a part of our clique. So it pervades itself in so many ways and fashions, and so that's why I think it has to be a collaboration effort on all fronts and ends.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point, I think we also heard that stated in Dr. King's speech, right? That it's a collective history. It's a history that in which Black and white are bound inextricably together. You can't separate any of this from itself. And so if we're really going to understand the narrative or the story that is the American story, it has to be told fully and authentically. And it begins with crisis points at the same times that it begins with democracy. You can't talk about the founding vision of democratic principles without also acknowledging the hypocrisy that this nation was founded on slavery, and it was also founded by the mass murder of indigenous populations. So those two horrific acts come side by side with a powerful vision of democratic principles. And how do we reconcile those? How do we speak about those two competing ideas? We have to acknowledge it in order to come to a full understanding of who and what we are as a country.
And you're right as far as it goes with, say, some of the people locally, that if they had great grandparents as far as family history, like you were saying, Reverend Glenn, who maybe were in the Civil War on the Confederate side, they might romanticize things more than, say, anybody else would be a history, but not necessarily a true history. So that's where we're having some issues with that. But one thing that you had brought up that surprised me, I didn't know about, is that African American home ownership was below 10% now. That one shocked me. So that was.
Yeah, so I have to give credit when credit is due. Being a lifelong learner, you have to cite your sources. Don't want to plagiarize. So I do have to give credit to Pastor Darnell Carruthers of the Greenbrier Baptist Church, who serves on, I believe, is the committee board for the Habitat for Humanities of Powhatan County. And so in our conversations, he let me know that according to their research, that minority, in particular Black home ownership within Powhatan County has dropped below double digits to just 8%. As we're having these conversations and things of that nature, what does that mean, and what does that look like? That Powhatan County, Powhatan, named after indigenous people, indigenous communities. How is it that Powhatan County now has below 10% in terms of minority home ownership? So and that's what we talk about the throes of justice and oppression, because not only do we have to tell the true story as it pertains to history within schools, but then we also have to tell the story about equitable resources within proximity. One of the things that I'm not from Powhatan County, but I pastor in Powhatan County. My great grandmother, Esther Smith, God rest her soul, she is from Powhatan County. Her father name was John Middleton. So the Middletons are from Powhatan County. So in knowing a little bit about Powhatan and now being a pastor, I learned about how very few and far between the minority community and population is within Powhatan County. And so that raises the question about when the Board of Supervisors are going in with these plans, are these plans affecting all or just some?
Absolutely. Wow, I can't believe it. I think we're coming to the end of the hour already. I'm in shock. This has been such great discussion. I could probably keep going for another couple of hours, but I know suddenly our online will drop. So just wanted to thank you all. And do you have any final parting words for us, Delegate?
Yes, I wanted to thank you, first of all, and thank you to all of the Powhatan Democrats for continuing the good fight. When I am down or discouraged by some of this dysfunction, and I apologize, you probably hear kids screaming in the background. They held
That's a
off.
good thing. That's a good thing.
They held off for as long as they could.
Yeah.
And but I want to say that when I'm down and when I'm discouraged, I remind myself of the hymn, "We Shall Overcome."
Mm.
And we won't overcome by being quiet. We won't overcome by going along to get along. We will overcome by continuing to fight. We'll overcome by continuing to use our voice, because one of the most powerful men in America in 1963 was not the president. It wasn't the wealthiest person in the world. It was the man who used his voice, who used his words to bring about generational change. And so I would just encourage everyone to remind yourself that we shall overcome, and we can use our voices just like Dr. King did. Don't think it's just all talk. Now I have a big mouth, but for those, little girls especially, who are told you talk too much, one day your words will change the world. And so, just the power of using our voice as advocates, never forget how powerful that is. And thank you so much for having me.
And just wanted to say before I left, we also had your mentor, Louise Lucas, out here, Senator Lucas,
Yes.
last year, and she tore the place up. So
She's amazing.
she is. She's something else. So thank you. Senator Hashmi, final words.
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing us together for this important conversation. And I don't want to end the evening without acknowledging the terrible tragedy that we just saw in Jacksonville, Florida. It's such a grim and horrible reminder that we are still struggling with this horrible specter of white supremacy and ideology of racial bigotry and violence, racial violence, that is truly concerning. So I want to acknowledge the families and the victims who suffered in this tragedy. But as Delegate King said, there is cause for optimism. We have to be optimistic. We have to be resilient. We know that there is a willingness in this country, most especially in our young people. I'm always encouraged when I talk to young folks. They truly have compassion and understanding for each other. They care passionately about this nation, about their future. And I think working with our young folks, we're going to overcome the crisis points that we've seen in this country for the past several centuries.
Thank you. And to just jump on top of that, I think that's what some politicians who like to stir things up for their own good don't necessarily recognize, that there are people out there who take them seriously and who, I don't want to say are mentally ill because I don't believe it's mental illness, but who are disturbed enough to go out and do something horrific like this. So people have to understand the words matter. We all have to understand that. So thank you. Now, finally, Reverend Glenn, finish off with.
Well, I think I've done enough talking for one night. So I just want to thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you so much to the honorable colleagues who I shared this platform with. I've been graced and made better by your presence. My last parting words, in our pursuit of doing the work of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm reminded of the Old Testament prophet Micah. And when we are in doubt about what we are called to do, the Old Testament prophet Micah laid out 3 simple things that we are called to do. And I try to do this every day of my life. And I hope that by departing these 3 things to everybody, we'll be able to do the work of justice just a little better. And so the prophet Micah says we are to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And so, as long as we just do the work of justice, we love mercy, and we walk humbly with our Creator, I believe that we'll be able to see, witness, and hear justice ring. And thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank all of you. And I appreciate everything you've done. And thank you for coming out on a Monday night. And this has been a labor of love for me. I really wanted to do this. I felt strongly moved to do this. So thank you all for doing this. Take care.